Christopher is in his first year of the doctoral program in physical therapy at Bond University. He graduated from the kinesiology program at the University of Toronto in 2022, when he also became a CROSH student member. The work that he's presenting today is from his master's degree, which he completed at Lakehead University in 2024. His work has focused on ergonomics and human factors in occupational settings, specifically firefighter mental health burden in public safety personnel populations. Welcome, Christopher. We're excited.
So thank you for attending today. My research is entitled Identifying the Mental Health Burden in a Composite Fire Service, an Integrated Knowledge Translation Approach. So first, I want to set some context for my work. So this work is not possible without acknowledging my research partner. So the process that we use in this kind of work is IKT, and it's important to acknowledge the role of the research partner and how this work came to be, incorporating them in the research process. So what IKT is, it's an approach that we use in science and involves the research partner in all phases of the research process. It can be complex because there are so many people involved. And just as a note, most of the research is being done around health-based settings. So where I'm unique in my work is that we're applying that approach in occupational health settings. So my research partner on this project is the Niagara West Fire and Emergency Service, located in the town of Lincoln, Ontario. So the Niagara West Fire and Emergency Service is a medium-sized composite fire service with approximately 118 volunteer firefighters across 4 fire stations, serving 25,000 people in a small rural community in southern Ontario. Additionally, these firefighters are expected to respond to both urban and rural emergencies due to the remote location of the town. So this is not the main focus of my work. The focus is the outcomes we targeted, but I did want to give the process of developing this partnership justice. So this is sort of the process that we use, kind of like how we all communicate over email, online meetings, and some in-person meetings. Additionally, this partnership took place from September of 2022 to May of 2024 in terms of just developing that partnership. So it really speaks to the amount of work that's required to build these partnerships so we can have effective research. So what do we already know about firefighter mental health? So critical incidents are work-related trauma exposure. So I think the important take-home here is the prevalence of CI exposure in fire. So upwards of 85% of firefighters will experience critical incidents within 2 months, while over 90% will experience at least one critical incident within their career. Additionally, what we know about CI exposure is that there's a link between critical incidents and mental illness. So thinking about post-traumatic stress injury and alcohol use disorder, there is literature to support that there is a relationship between those two constructs. So it's important for us to think about CI exposure when we develop our projects and when we think about assessing mental health burden. So I just talked about work-related trauma. I also think it's important to recognize that firefighters also face trauma outside of work. So non-work related trauma is an exposure to threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Additionally, approximately 70% of the population may experience some form of traumatic event in their lifetime. So non-work related exposures also influence PTSI and AUD risks. It's an important consideration that a research partner and ourselves have identified as we move through this work. So PTSI refers to the mental health conditions that a person may experience from exposure to one or more potentially psychologically traumatic events. Ramsden et al. Identified that mental health injuries rank 3rd among the top 5 leading causes of lost time claims, workplace disability claims, and fatalities within Canadian firefighters. So among first responders, 44% tested positive for a mental illness, more specifically 23% for PTSD, and within 2 years of active service, 35% of firefighters will develop symptoms diagnosable for PTSD. Lastly, a large barrier to both diagnosis and receiving treatment is stigma. Therefore, it's hypothesized that these values may be higher due to underreporting. So alcohol use disorders, or AUD, is defined as a medical condition characterized by an impaired ability to stop or control alcohol use despite adverse social, occupational, or health consequences, where approximately 50% of firefighters engage in heavy drinking and 58% engage in binge drinking using alcohol to cope with work-related CI exposures. Additionally, there is a 47% lifetime prevalence of AUD among firefighters, almost double compared to a 29% in the general population. Finally, PTSI and CI exposure are major risk and maintenance factors for developing AUD and are caused by external factors rather than occurring on their own. And stigma is also seen as a barrier to diagnosis and treatment, leading to underreporting. So the overriding purpose of the study was to determine the mental health burden among NWFES firefighters. So the primary research objective was to identify indices of mental health and understand how these indices impact NWFES firefighter mental health. So the three questions that answer this objective are A, what is the mental health burden among NWFES firefighters? B, what is the relationship between mental health exposures and mental illness? And C, what is the relationship between PTSI risk and AUD risk? So through the literature, cumulative exposures to critical incidents and brief trauma increase the likelihood of developing PTSI and AUDs, and cumulative PTSI symptom experiences increase the likelihood of developing an AUD. So to briefly highlight, the demographic questionnaire was used to record gender, years of service, benefits from full-time employment, for example. So the way I assessed an individual's exposure to different incidences that may influence their mental health was through the critical incident inventory and the brief trauma questionnaire. So the CII-24 addressed exposures at work, and the BTQ assessed exposures outside of work. Lastly, the way I assessed mental health injury risk was by using the PCL5 to identify post-traumatic stress injury risk, and the audit C to identify alcohol use disorder risk. So created from a previous study, the demographic questionnaire was adapted to suit Niagara West Fire and Emergency Service firefighters. This allowed us to see how our study findings fit into the literature. The demographic questionnaire has some traditional questions that we asked of our sample population, along with specific questions requested by our research partner. So the critical incident inventory contains 24 reported self-reported items on critical incident exposure occurring within the previous 2 months of duty, with an optional questionnaire with an extended time period of 2 years. So items are multiple choice based questions indicating if a firefighter has experienced a specific critical incident 1 time, 2 times, more than 3 times, or none within the past 2 months. In addition to frequency, CII-24 reports the types of critical incident exposure a firefighter is subjected to based on the total scores as well as 6 subscales. Lastly, the questionnaire was reviewed alongside Fire Services knowledge user to determine its feasibility for implementation. So the brief trauma questionnaire is a 10-item self-report instrument assessing traumatic exposure according to the DSM-5 criterion A. In terms of scoring, the BTQ is nominal, meaning any items are scored as positive for experiencing traumatic exposure if the respondent answers yes to these questions. So this is a tenet of self-report scale, and the participants' responses were stratified based on these categories. So overall, the purpose of this questionnaire was for us to assess general life trauma outside of work. So the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist for the DSM-5, known as the PCL5, is a 20-item self-report questionnaire on symptom experiences based on the DSM-5 diagnostic manual experienced in the last 1 month, with an optional questionnaire with an extended time period of lifetime. So the items on the PCL5 are scored based on a 5-point Likert scale, with 0 indicating that PTSI symptoms were not at all experienced, to 4 indicating that PTSI symptoms were extremely experienced. So the PCL5 is scored based on a total score, and the summation of scores provides a score from 17 to 85, which constitutes diagnosable PTSD. So the alcohol use disorder identification consumption test, known as the Audit C, is a 3-item self-report brief alcohol screening instrument identifying hazardous drinkers or individuals who have active alcohol use disorders, including alcohol abuse or dependence. So the Audit C has 5 different answer choices for each question to identify hazardous drinking and active alcohol use disorders. So the Audit C is scored based on a total score, and the summation of scores provides a score from 0 to 12. The total scoring classification is different based on sex, meaning a score of 4 or greater for males, and a score of 3 or more for females means respondents are at an increased risk of hazardous drinking or have an active alcohol use disorder. So to answer the question, what is the mental health burden among NWFES firefighters? I used a quantitative approach to quantify mental health burden experienced by volunteer firefighters, which was explored using a battery of questionnaires. I gathered descriptive statistics about demographics, measures of mental health exposures, and negative mental health outcomes using SPSS. So specifically testing the assumptions required analyzing the median, mode, and interquartile range as my variability measure. So this statistical analysis allowed me to quantify the mental health burden. So in total, 54 participants volunteered to take part in this research study, of which 94% were males and 6% were females. Of the participants, the mean age was approximately 45 years with a standard deviation of about 13 years. In addition, the mean years of service was about 12 and a half years with a standard deviation of about 10 years. Participant service ranks included 7% probationary firefighters, 56% at the rank of firefighter, 20% having a rank of captain, and 17% in the other category. So in the table above, in the past 2 months, the median of CI total exposures was 1 with a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 47 exposures. In the previous 2 years, the median of CI total exposures was 7 with a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 40 exposures. So next, I'm looking at the figure below. On the vertical axis, what I'm showing is the percentage of firefighters that reported having at least one exposure to one of the traumas in the critical incident inventory. And the horizontal axis shows the subscales of the CAI-24. So in the past 2 months, 56% of volunteer firefighters reported experiencing at least one CI. When examining the subscales, 44% reported being exposed to the trauma to self subscale, followed by 41% reporting exposures that included multiple casualties. When assessing the subscales within the past 2 years, these same two constructs were equally reported at 64%. So examples of the trauma to self subscale include serious line of duty injury to self and direct exposure to blood and bodily fluids. And examples of multiple casualties include responding to incidences involving multiple serious injuries and 3 or more deaths. So next, when looking at the table above, overall, firefighters were exposed to a median of 2, IQR of 2, and a mode of 1 non-work-related trauma exposures within their lifetime with a range of 7. When looking at the figure below, on the vertical axis, what I'm showing is the percentage of firefighters that reported having at least one exposure to one of the traumas in the brief trauma questionnaire. And the horizontal axis shows the subscales of the BTQ. So overall, 83% of volunteer firefighters reported exposure to at least one non-work-related trauma exposure, and 17 were not exposed at all. The life threat or serious injury subscale was the most frequent non-work-related traumatic event, faced by 59% of firefighters, according to descriptive data from the BTQ. So examples of this subscale include, have you ever been in a serious car accident or a serious accident at work or somewhere else? And before the age of 18, were you ever physically punished or beaten by a parent, caretaker, or teacher? Additionally, the second most frequent non-work-related trauma subscale was the has this ever happened to you subscale, reported by 46% of firefighters. So examples of this subscale include, has a close family member or friend died violently, for example, in a serious car crash, mugging, or attack? And have you ever witnessed a situation in which someone was seriously injured or killed? So next, looking at the table above, NWFES firefighters' overall total PTSI symptom experiences had a median of 4, a mode of 0, and an IQR of 12 in the past 1 month. Additionally, the overall total PTSI symptom experiences of firefighters across their lifetime had a median of 6, a mode of 0, and an IQR of 14. So next, when looking at the figure below, on the vertical axis, what I'm showing is the percentage of firefighters that reported no risk, low, moderate, and high PTSI risk. And the horizontal axis shows the PTSI risk categories. So while 48% experienced a low risk and 37% of firefighters are at no risk of PTSI, it's important to highlight that there are still 15% of firefighters in the moderate PTSI risk category. Additionally, when examining volunteer firefighter high-risk threshold for PTSI, no one was at high risk in the past month. Over a lifetime period, 47% of firefighters reported low risk for PTSI, while 33% reported no risk, 16% reported moderate risk, and only 4% reported high risk of PTSI. Lastly, when looking at the table above, NWFES firefighters' AUD risk for male symptom experiences had a median of 4, a mode of 4, and an IQR of 3. Female firefighter symptom experiences had a median of 3, a mode of 3, and an IQR of 2. When looking at the figure below, the vertical axis is showing the percentage of firefighters that reported low, moderate, high, and severe AUD risk. And the horizontal axis shows the AUD risk categories. So the graph on the left is for male firefighters, and on the right is for female firefighters. So 35% of male firefighters reported exhibiting AUD symptoms constituting both low risk and moderate risk. Additionally, 26% of male firefighters were at a high risk for AUDs, and 4% identified as having a severe risk. On the other hand, 100% of female firefighters reported exhibiting AUD symptoms constituting moderate AUD risk. So to answer the questions, what is the relationship between mental health exposures and mental illness? And what is the relationship between PTSI risk and AUD risk? I conducted a series of Spearman rank correlations. So this statistical tool was used to explore the strength of the relationship between mental health exposures, so work-related and non-work-related, and mental illness, and between PTSI risk and AUD risk. And to determine if these variables have a positive or negative correlation, examining significance denoted as P and RS. So we found a non-statistically significant relationship between work-related exposure and PCL5 scores, and between work-related exposure and audit C scores. Additionally, we also found a non-statistically significant relationship between non-work-related exposure and audit C scores. So now we're looking at the relationship between non-work-related trauma and mental illness. So the way I did that was looking at the BTQ scores and the PCL5 scores. So the PCL5 is an indice of PTSI risk, and the BTQ is a measure of exposures related to non-work-related traumas. So what you can see here on my slide with the BTQ scores on the vertical axis and the PCL5 scores on the horizontal axis is a moderate positive significant relationship between these two constructs, which means that as non-work-related trauma increases, so does PTSI risk. So now here we're looking at the relationship between PTSI risk and AUD risk. And the way I did that was looking at the PCL5 scores and the audit C scores. So the PCL5 is an indice of PTSI risk, and the audit C is an indice of AUD risk. So what you can see here on my slide with the PCL5 scores on the vertical axis and the audit C scores on the horizontal axis is a weak positive significant relationship between these two constructs, which means that with slight increases in PTSI risk, so does AUD risk. So here you can see some of the clustering around some of the data points where low PTSI risk results in low AUD risk. So it's evident that the dispersion of the data demonstrates a weak relationship, but there is some indication in the smaller sample of a relationship between PTSI risk and AUD risk. NWFES firefighters, in comparison to other Canadian firefighter samples, are exposed less frequently and at a lower risk overall during the past 2 months. Recent studies stated that nearly 92% of firefighters experienced one critical incident over their career, while 85% of firefighters experienced at least one critical incident in the past 2 months. So these findings suggest that our sample of volunteer firefighters face less frequent CI exposure compared to other firefighter samples. So a reason for lower CI exposure can be due to the geographical location of the service. So compared to larger city centers, rural communities have smaller populations, which decreases the total number of CIs that firefighters can respond to. Additionally, lower CI exposures may be due to its volunteer-based structure. So volunteers who have full-time jobs like teaching or the first responder roles are only required for scheduled on-call shifts and respond to CIs when available. So members not on call or unavailable do not respond to CIs, reducing their exposure. Additionally, unlike Thunder Bay's 184 career firefighters, NWFES has 118 volunteers, making them relatively similarly sized services. So with more members serving a smaller geographical and less populated area, some firefighters may face fewer CIs compared to those in larger cities. So exposure to non-work-related trauma for this population was relatively low, which differs from what is observed in other first responder groups. The most frequent subscale was life threat or serious injury. This may be due to the geographical conditions and location, since Lincoln is a rural community which provides a variety of high-risk outdoor occupations and activities which can contribute to trauma outside of work. Furthermore, high non-work-related trauma risk has been linked to increases in stress and decrease in resiliency, which could impact firefighters' duty performance and lead to other mental illnesses such as PTSI and AUD. So this study reported that non-work-related trauma posed a low risk for volunteer firefighters, indicating that its impact on the overall group was small. Lastly, some firefighters at NWFES reported not having encountered life-threatening occurrences, and the possibility of ambiguity in responding to the BTQ questions about such events may have contributed to this response. So the rate of volunteer firefighters exposed to at least one PTSI symptom is higher than the general population of 3.9. Additionally, in a similarly sized fire service, NWFES PTSI risk was lower. So a recent study conducted with a Thunder Bay Career Fire Service found that 15% of firefighters were at no risk, 71% were at low risk, 13% were at a moderate risk, and 1% were at a high risk of PTSI. However, in our study, we found a 22% increase of volunteer firefighters who reported no risk of PTSI. There was a 23% decrease of firefighters who reported a low risk, a 2% increase in moderate risk, and a 1% decrease reporting high risk of PTSI. So this is similar to previous literature where compared to career firefighters, volunteer firefighters reported slightly lower average scores and were less likely to meet the criteria for PTSI and AUD. In addition, NWFES firefighters who were exposed to at least one PTSI symptom reported slightly higher PTSI symptoms over a longer exposure period than those experienced in 1 month. So overall, 35% of male firefighters reported both low and moderate risk, 26% reported high risk, and 100% of females reported moderate risk of AUD and NWFES. So in comparison to several other studies, a disturbingly high prevalence of heavy alcohol consumption and binge drinking was found among male and female firefighters, and the negative health effects of women and AUD is significant. So while it's unclear what led to firefighters to be at these AUD risk levels, 60% of male firefighters were found to be within the moderate to high category, and 100% of females reported a moderate risk of potentially screening positive for AUD, which is a concern. So findings show that there is a moderate positive relationship between non-work-related trauma exposure and PTSI risk. So this statistically significant relationship suggests that as non-work-related trauma exposure increases, there is a corresponding increase in the risk of post-traumatic stress symptoms among volunteer firefighters. So this relationship underscores that firefighters who have greater exposure to non-work-related trauma are more likely to report PTSI symptoms within a month. These findings are consistent with prior research that has established the cumulative effect of various forms of trauma exposure on mental health outcomes, indicating that personal life experiences outside of the work environment can significantly impact psychological well-being. So findings identified a statistically significant weak positive relationship between PTSI and AUD risks. Previous studies indicated that there is a relationship between PTSI and AUD risk, showing that those with higher levels of PTSI symptoms are at a greater risk for developing alcohol use disorders as a coping mechanism. However, in our study, the relationship between PTSI risk and AUD risk is weak or inconsistent, indicating that the link between these variables is not strong enough to reliably predict one from the other. So this relationship highlights the importance of monitoring both PTSI and AUD risks concurrently, as individuals with sustained or high PTSI risk may be at a slightly elevated risk for AUD. And research has shown that firefighters consume alcohol as a way to mitigate mental illnesses associated with their work-related CI exposure, including PTSI and negative emotional states. Addressing these risks in tandem is critical, as previous research has shown that comorbid PTSI and AUD can complicate treatment and recovery outcomes. So the KT strategy focused on identifying efficient methods to apply research findings in practice, ensuring rapid uptake of and implementation by the partner organization. The approach employed with the partnership aimed at assessing the mental health challenges faced by NWFES and enhancing overall firefighter well-being. Additionally, IKT enabled the active dissemination of research processes and outcomes to key stakeholders, including volunteer firefighters, the primary knowledge user, management, and the occupational health and safety team. Lastly, an infographic summarizing the preliminary findings was created collaboratively with the primary knowledge user and shared with the services stakeholders. So on the last slide here, I have some take-home messages of this study. So NWFES firefighters are exposed to work-related and non-work-related traumas less frequently and at a lower risk overall. 15% of firefighters experience moderate risk for PTSI in 1 month, whereas 20% experience moderate to high risk for PTSI over their lifetime. And 29% of male firefighters experience high to severe risk of AUD, whereas 100% of females and 35% of male firefighters experience a moderate risk of AUD. Now, work-related adverse events did not appear to impact PTSI risk or alcohol abuse. non-work related trauma did not impact alcohol abuse, but it did impact PTSI risk. So as PTSI risk increased, so did the likelihood of using alcohol. So overall, these findings suggest that there is a more important impact of non-work related trauma on PTSI risk and alcohol abuse. So I will now open up the floor to any questions. Any questions that I cannot answer in this time, feel free to email me, and I believe my LinkedIn is also attached to if you want to send me a direct message.
Terrific. Thank you. That was very interesting. There are a couple of questions here. The first one is from Joelle Poulin. Do you plan to expand and work with wildland firefighters? As a former wildland firefighter, I can tell you that the effects of isolation and the stress that comes with fire management processes are long lasting.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Yeah, so I think when I did this research with volunteer services, it was actually a large leap. When we look at the research that's currently out there, it's mostly with career fire services, so services that have paid firefighters. So where I'm unique in my work is we made the branch to study volunteer fire services because there's not a lot of research on volunteer fire services, and I believe also, yeah, it would be a great next step to move into wildland firefighters, especially with what's going on right now. There's not a lot of research on wildland firefighters.
Yeah. Agree. Okay, and Bernard Fontaine has a question. While this study focuses on firefighters, has a similar study been done for other emergency responders, such as law enforcement, especially in more populated cities?
Yeah, so yeah, there is a lot of research that is being conducted with law enforcement, with paramedics, with other public safety personnel, military personnel. But yeah, again, there's not a lot of research that has been conducted with volunteer fire services, so that's like an understudied population. And I feel like if
Right,
we can study those understudied populations more, we can understand the burden in those populations as well.
right. Okay. Thank you. We are out of time. So, and I think so far we've answered the questions. So, thank you so much. That was a really good presentation, and best of luck in your doctoral work. Keep us posted.